somebody who appears to be a marginal player in the censorship industrial complex displaying her intellectual leadership and her institutional leadership in really envisioning this complex come into being. This is Renee DiResta's Mona Lisa. This is her finest hour. This is the most powerful that she's ever been, and let's hope ever will be. This is a video that she gave. This is a video that Renee DiResta gives at the end of the 4th annual Cybersecurity Summit that's put on by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is a part of the Department of Homeland Security. It was ostensibly around just physical infrastructure, including election infrastructure, and then as the head of the Department of Homeland Security under Obama was leaving in January 2017, they expanded its mission. They grew the mission so that it would then cover the media coverage of elections. And so suddenly its mandate significantly increased. And so that became the initial justification for basically this so-called war on disinformation by this government agency working with proxies to do its dirty censorship business. And so what this is about, this video is about creating a social norm that this is okay to do. That this is something that should be done, that a U.S. government agency should be working with Stanford University, which is where Renee DiResta works, University of Washington, Graphica, which is a research organization, and the DFR lab, which is the Disinformation Forensics Lab at the Atlantic Council, which is a big, powerful think tank in both the United States and Europe. So all right, let's take a look. Let's get into it. So you can see Renee DiResta, Technical Research Manager, Stanford Internet Observatory. This is for the CISA Cybersecurity Summit.
Hi, my name is Renee DiResta, and I'm the Research Manager at Stanford Internet Observatory. Today, to kick off this session, I'm going to be talking about the power of partnerships.
Now I want to stop with that. So this is about the power of partnerships. What she's referring to is the censorship industrial complex. That's what partnerships are. The partnership in this case is between the Department of Homeland Security organization, CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and particularly these 4 groups: Stanford, University of Washington, Atlantic Council's Disinformation Forensics Lab, and Graphica, which is a research organization, supposedly a research organization. Those 4 groups are basically being subcontracted out by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security to demand more censorship by social media platforms. That's what she's describing here, and I view this video as a way to sort of normalize this process of government censorship of social media platforms. There's an argument that's occurring right now where people say this is totally fine. Governments have a right to tell the platforms that they have an opinion about what they should have on the platforms. And while that's technically true, when you have politicians, including the President of the United States, simultaneously threatening to take away their license to operate in the form of Section 230, when Congress is actively considering taking away Section 230, and it's all happening behind closed doors, secretly, between these 4 groups and the social media platform executives, it's a secretive censorship process, and it has to be understood as that. This is not happening out in the open. I think the videos, which of course nobody sees, nobody knows of, they don't publicize, they get created to sort of say, hey, yeah, we were transparent about it, even though everything that they're describing in here that they were doing to pressure the social media platforms to censor more was done secretly behind the scenes without any public transparency or visibility into what they were doing. So again, it's the power of partnerships. Think of that as the power of the government to violate the First Amendment and censor private corporations without anybody knowing, by using proxies, including organizations that are funded by the Department of Homeland Security, National Science Foundation, the Defense Department, and or other agencies.
So our team at SIO and CISA's team have done some pioneering work in partnership thinking about how to respond to mis and disinformation in areas in which it can have significant harm.
And just keep in mind, SIO is Stanford Internet Observatory. That's where their organization is based. I think it's also important to point out at this point that Renee DiResta finally was forced to admit that she had been a CIA fellow And that was something that she had not publicly disclosed in any event. And it came out, it was discovered by Mike Benz going through many, many YouTubes where it sort of slipped out in some introduction that he made of her at Stanford a few years ago. But she was finally forced to admit that she has had this CIA tie for almost 2 decades.
One of those areas is elections, and I'm going to talk about some learnings from work that we did on that topic today. So in August 2020, students from the Stanford Internet Observatory were doing an internship with CISA, and they identified a massive gap in the capability of federal, state, and local governments to become aware of, to analyze, and to rapidly respond to mis and disinformation, both foreign and domestic, targeting the 2020 election.
So this is I have to say, I don't believe this story that she's telling. So she's saying that these students at Stanford themselves just were like, hey, there's this missing role for some institution that should be involved in basically demanding social media censorship of information that we call disinformation or misinformation. I'm highly skeptical of that. It sounds like it came right from Renee DiResta or one of her colleagues, but that they're sort of putting on the students to make it sound like it wasn't part of some broader plan, which I believe has been going on here to increase government censorship of social media platforms. So I'm skeptical of that claim that she just made.
Now that gap had several components. The federal government wasn't prepared to identify and analyze election mis and disinfo.
So the first thing she says is, why do we need it? Because the government wasn't prepared to do it. They just didn't have the staff or the capability to do it. Okay, that's the first thing she says. And of course, those of us that believe in free speech are like, that's a good thing. The government has no capability to put pressure on social media platforms to censor Americans for their speech.
There was no clear federal lead to coordinate the work.
So there's no clear federal lead. There wasn't somebody in government that you could call up and say, hey, we need to demand that Facebook take this post down.
Because the IC, of course, is rightly limited to a foreign focus, and the FBI also has very specific designations and limitations.
So she just used a bit of jargon there. So, IC, of course, is the intelligence community. And I think showing this is a video for a specialized audience, but she's saying, the intelligence community is focused on foreign threats, as it should be, because the creators of our country did not want our police spying on us for the things that we said. That would be a violation of the First Amendment. So she says the intelligence community doesn't do it, and then she kind of goes, the FBI also really doesn't do it either. And it's like, well, yeah. However, of course, as we've also discovered in the Twitter files, there was this thing called the Foreign Influence Task Force that the FBI was part of that was involved in surveilling and monitoring and demanding the censorship of disfavored speech.
CISA had created support but had no real capability. There were unclear legal authorities, including very real First Amendment questions.
Oh, so there it is. There it is. There's sort of the key to the whole thing. Of course, there were some free speech questions, like how would you actually get away with having the government empower private organizations like Stanford to demand censorship by social media companies? So yeah, there were some real concerns there. She wants to seem like she's taking these First Amendment concerns seriously by just mentioning it. But as you realize when you watch this, she suggests nothing to protect against violations of the First Amendment. The whole enterprise is a violation of the First Amendment. And so just sort of talking about it is supposed to kind of reassure you. You have to think that some of the audience for this are the elected officials, other people in government, the people at the Department of Homeland Security who might be like, hey, isn't this going to violate the First Amendment? And her being like, well, of course we're taking that totally seriously as we develop our partnerships, even though the partnership itself is the violation of the First Amendment.
There was no expertise resident within the federal government to analyze public content across platforms to identify trends and risks. There was a lack of reporting mechanisms for state and local partners to surface activity that they saw building in their communities to help them understand it.
In other words, there was nobody in government at the federal or the local level who was already spying on Americans for what they were saying on social media platforms. That's what she's saying. There wasn't somebody that was out there spying on all the social media platforms at the same time to see what they were saying. There was no government surveillance of speech in the United States. And we realized that was a real gap. Like, that's what she's saying here. I mean, I just think it's kind of shocking when you really appreciate, and she's doing it in this particular thing that you get out of a lot when people are often delivering super controversial hot things in politics, whatever, just kind of making it sound super normal. And some students just identified a gap in that there's no surveillance of Americans for what they're saying and no concerted effort to censor them. And we realized that was a gap. It's like a gap that's like the benefit of living in a free country, a free society.
The federal government was building relationships with tech platforms, but there's a healthy distrust both ways, for a good reason. So a trusted, nonpartisan partnership with expertise in the way that misinformation moved on public platforms, with analysts capable of understanding public conversations, and a broad ability to explore publicly available data was needed.
She just described the censorship industrial complex. That is the censorship industrial complex. She's saying we need organizations that are supposedly nonpartisan, objective, full of experts who can evaluate what people are saying on different social media platforms, involve the government, and then demand censorship. That's what she's saying here. One of their responses to our reporting on them is to say that, hey, we weren't doing any censorship. We were just doing research. But the research was all in service of demanding the censorship by the social media platforms of these disfavored voices and disfavored posts relating to disfavored narratives, like namely vaccine hesitancy or election skepticism.
So in response, SIO began to envision infrastructure capable of real-time observation and reporting on election-related misinformation.
SIO is the Stanford Internet Observatory. So what she's saying is, so SIO started to envision this way to report in real time on what people are saying in social media platforms so that we can censor them. That's what she's saying right here, right now. And she's doing it in a way that I think is very sophisticated. It's designed to make you comfortable with this kind of surveillance of political speech in the United States.
Targeted at disenfranchising voters and eroding public confidence in the legitimacy of our elections.
So she wants to choose two things that she thinks they can actually legally justify. Now remember, it's important to remember the Supreme Court really protects a broad amount of free speech. Really everything except for lying to commit fraud and immediate incitement of violence. Like, for example, some of the violence that we saw against Riley Gaines in San Francisco, where people are saying, hurt that person, beat up that person, and the person is right there. To expand it to then say, well, we're going to go after speech that raises questions about the legitimacy of institutions or elections, you've already gone way beyond what the First Amendment, First Amendment allows that. You've gone way beyond what the Supreme Court is willing to constrain and prohibit under the Constitution.
We facilitated the formation of a highly impactful coalition,
so here you can see
uniting
the
combined skills of 4 leading research institutions, underpinned by the enthusiastic support of trained students researchers. And this became the Election Integrity Partnership, which interfaced with election officials, civil society orgs, platforms, and the public to share data-driven analysis and real-time observations around voting-related misinformation circulating during the 2020 election. We had a narrowly tailored scope.
Here she says very clear, she says, this is a very narrow scope. She wants to emphasize that. We're only going to censor, legitimate free speech very narrowly.
Focused on false and misleading narratives specific to voting. And the project was built with the intent to plug the gaps for the 2020 election, but it became something else as well. A first prototype of a nonpartisan model for collaborative, multi-stakeholder analysis of mis and disinformation.
In other words, it became the first attempt, the first big project of the censorship industrial complex. And so they wanted to choose something that they felt was the least controversial, which would be censoring information, censoring false information about where people could go to be elected, or to vote, I should say, and censoring information, as we saw, about absentee ballots. And you sort of go, well, that seems okay. You don't want to have lies on these social media platforms about when the voting day is. But then it suddenly became, well, it's not safe to do vote by mail. Well, if you say it's not safe or it's not reliable, it's not getting into the realm of opinion, maybe that's your opinion, that there's some risk that if the mailman takes your vote rather than you drop it off at the voting place, that it is less safe. So you see how quickly, it's not a slippery slope, it's more like this thing that you might get everybody in the society to agree is legitimate to put some pressure on the social media companies to censor, very then quickly kind of goes, well, then we should also censor this idea that mail-in balloting is not safe. So it's not a slippery slope, it's like an immediate move in either direction.
The Election Integrity Partnership started in September 2020. We had stakeholder types who could surface instances of concern.
Stakeholder types, so government, civil society, platforms, media, so these are the people that are going to be demanding the censorship.
Civil society and government flagged things that were emerging in their communities.
So they're spying on their neighbors.
Our own analysts did proactive detection as well.
We also spied on people.
We created tickets and an intake queue to track the evolution of incidents over time, to see if false or misleading claims were gaining in reach or velocity.
That's the key here. So it's important to understand that these guys are really not out to censor every last thing. They don't need total control over the discourse, over the communications environment. They're looking specifically to stop things that go viral. They're looking to stop stuff that reaches a lot of people. So that's her emphasis. That's what Renee is constantly emphasizing here. And in fact, it's such a main focus that the next version of this partnership is called the Virality Project, and it's specifically focused on stopping viral narratives that result in vaccine hesitancy.
There were multiple tiers of analysis, ensuring that any particular incident or piece of content had several pairs of eyes on it. And as analysis went on, we closed the loop with the reporting stakeholder to help ensure that they understood the dynamics of whatever had inspired their concern. Now, sometimes these false and misleading narratives went nowhere. People are wrong on the internet regularly, and it's not a cause for concern.
We don't worry about it when it doesn't go viral.
But other times, however, things that are false or misleading do begin to go wildly viral, and local election officials and platform integrity teams alike needed a way to distinguish between the two to help them determine their response. Some of you may recall the dynamics of what came to be known as Sharpiegate, in which voters in Maricopa County, Arizona, became deeply concerned about the pens that they were given to mark their ballots. This situation progressed from what we call sense-making, just communities of people trying to figure out what happened, to deep concern, to a conspiracy theory that supporters of President Trump specifically were being targeted. And these concerns later evolved into in-person protest. This became something of a pattern in our analysis observations. A first-person photo or video documented a purported incident, social media discussion elevated it to a narrative, and then at times that progressed into a conspiracy theory. So we analyzed incidents and narratives both qualitatively, ascertaining the concern and ensuring that local officials who were attempting to respond understood the specifics. And we also assessed them quantitatively, looking at specific tweets and posts that precipitated massive virality and the widespread dissemination of false and misleading narratives. We looked at network dynamics across the full political spectrum, at clusters of accounts that amplified messages, again because of genuine concern, but then also at what we called repeat spreaders, which were linchpin accounts that regularly featured prominently in spreading demonstrably false or misleading claims.
They literally call these folks super spreaders. It's amazing how much of and what a funny coincidence is all being around later about the pandemic. But yeah, so these are the super spreaders of misinformation, which of course they now label people like me and other political opponents, just people that you disagree with. They suddenly become super spreaders of misinformation. Then you get them on blacklists of the social media companies, and voila, you've censored a whole group of people in your society, often without them knowing it.
We assessed not only social media across all of these dynamics, but the interplay with media as well, recognizing the significant impact that kind of mid-tier classes of transmitters, influencers, and hyperpartisan media had on shaping the public discourse.
This is really important to understand how they think about it. In other words, they're not just worried about getting censorship on social media platforms, they're also worried about controlling the media narrative, the broader news media narrative. So when you read Jacob Siegel's piece in Tablet, that's what he's also talking about. He's saying the word censorship and the word propaganda aren't even enough to capture this complexity of just trying to control the entire information environment in a holistic way. So they're concerned about stuff going from the social media platforms into the news media. And indeed, we saw that. So when these guys, the same folks, tried to stop the accurate story of Hunter Biden's laptop from spreading, they basically labeled it not exactly a conspiracy theory, but Russian disinformation, which itself was, of course, disinformation. And then they knew that the laptop story would get out. They just wanted to shape how it was interpreted by the national news media. And that's what they did. And so that people thought, oh, the Hunter Biden laptop sounds like Russian disinformation. It's probably not true. Of course, it was true. It wasn't Russian disinformation, but they were able to use basically what happened online as a reason to basically misdescribe a factual story as a potentially inaccurate one.
We saw top-down dynamics that came from media reporting a story and the public discussing it, but also increasingly things that came from the bottom up, like Sharpiegate, in which concerned members of the public would precipitate the narrative, and it would ultimately be covered by these other types of participants, leading to mass public awareness.
You have to wonder, this was made in 2021, you have to wonder if they could have if like a national U.S. government organization could have gotten away with putting the name of the president as a spreader of misinformation in one of its graphics a year earlier. I suspect not.
often before the claim had had time to be fact-checked or assessed in any way.
It's also worth pointing out that Renee herself, she worked for the Democrats. She worked for the Democrats for the Senate Intelligence Committee. She gave the lead testimony. There's a very famous picture of her with Hillary Clinton. She's somebody that's been a Democratic Party activist since she lived in the Bay Area and really remains that today at Stanford.
And while, unfortunately, the vast majority of voting-related misinformation in the 2020 election was domestic, our team evaluated foreign activity as well, finding participation from Russia, Iran, and China in some unique and distinct ways.
Of course, what's going on here is you see both with Peace Data, Proud Boys, these are both ostensibly real organizations. We now know that Proud Boys had a huge number of FBI infiltrators in it. We also know that we think that Peace Data also had a number of real people following it and involved with it. So you're starting to get to a space of potentially, being able to discredit and censor people that were actually involved in real politics by sort of smearing them as foreign disinformation.
One of the key determinants in what goes viral across any topic is the policies that social media companies set. And so we additionally prioritized not only understanding and evaluating, but also constructively critiquing platform policies.
So now they're saying we're going to try to get in there and change the social media platforms' policies. So now you have the U.S. government, working with and funding unaccountable private sector organizations to basically create new forms of censorship directly through the policies of these social media companies.
At the start of EIP, not all platforms that we analyzed had election-related policies. As we published our analyses publicly, most of those that did not added such policies.
In other words, we got them to change their policies. That's kind of amazing. I mean, the ambition here and the success of it is pretty impressive when you consider it. They actually did these things. They actually did this. They actually engaged in the censorship and got policies changed at the platforms.
Those that already had them often made them more comprehensive. We saw a real evolution over time. Several platforms, for example, implemented a repeat spreader strike system after the election and then have since applied it to other areas of misinformation that causes significant harm.
So in other words, they put people on blacklists, and then they kept adding, flags or new blacklists that they were on for other issues. So there's secret blacklists that these U.S. government partnered organizations created.
The Election Integrity Partnership ended data collection on November 19, 2020. And during that time, the partnership processed 639 tickets on election-related mis- and disinformation.
Now, what are those tickets? These tickets are, I think most people hear them, they go, oh, that's like a single post. It's not. It can contain thousands of tweets and Facebook posts in a single ticket. The ticket is can involve thousands of people. These are huge amounts. These tickets themselves are often connected to broader narratives that they're looking to censor,
of which 72% were related to delegitimizing the election results. Tech platform partners Twitter, Google, Facebook, and TikTok responded directly to 75% or more of the tickets in which they were tagged.
So they got the social media companies to basically act on 75% of the tickets, which is pretty amazing. That's a very high level of responsiveness.
A testament to both the high quality of reporting and the value of constructive relationships with the platforms.
I mean, that's the creepy part of it. They kind of go, oh, it's a testament to the fact that we kind of got all cozy with them. I mean, you have to remember, that ordinary people, including myself, when I was censored by Facebook, we had no way of appealing. I even knew people at the company and tried to reach out to them. That's the main way that people try to deal with this. There's like a star chamber. There's a completely undemocratic process of being censored, and there's no appeals. But what they were doing behind the scenes, because of their cozy little partnerships, they were able to get action on 75% of the things that they flagged.
And although EIP did not make specific enforcement recommendations, because those are the platforms to determine in accordance with its policies.
That's her way of saying we were not censoring. We did not actually do the censorship or say specifically what they should do. They would walk right up to it. You'd be like, this person is spreading false information and it's hurting people in the real world. You decide what to do, but we're saying, geez, what are you doing here? And then the pressure was put on by the politicians, from senators, members of Congress, people in the White House, all basically working in concert as a single censorship industrial complex.
35% of the URLs flagged were actioned under remove, reduce, or inform policies.
So 1/3 of all the of all the web links, of all the URLs, the social media companies took action on them to reduce their spread. In the case of Google, it would be to not be picked up in the searches, to not go viral on Twitter or Facebook. I mean, that's amazing and shocking and disturbing. She's saying it worked. The 1/3 of all the things that we wanted, 1/3 of all the URLs we wanted censored, were censored by the social media platforms.
Again, helping contextualize for the public the content that they were seeing.
That sounds very innocent. In some of them, it was just putting little labels on it to contextualize the context. Well, or to contextualize to provide some context for it. Well, we saw that this was actually used to discredit accurate information. This was used to discredit Martin Kildorff at Harvard University for saying that kids did not necessarily need to be vaccinated. They put a flag on that. She's saying, providing more context. Actually, it can also provide mis and disinformation from the government. That's part of what's going on.
Following the success of EIP and the certification of the 2020 election, SIO ramped down its monitoring and analysis capability because we thought that we were done with that work.
Oh, we thought we were all done. Sure you did.
However, almost immediately, we recognized the need to ramp back up.
Oh!
This time to support government health officials' efforts to combat misinformation targeting the COVID-19 vaccines.
We didn't want to keep going and keep censoring them. We thought we were done. And then it just became clear we were going to have to do it on COVID vaccines. It just became our obligation.
In February 2021, we formally established the Virality Project, drawing on the same partners from EIP and adding a few more.
So 2 months later, we started up again.
And much like EIP, it focused on real-time observation, analysis, and understanding of cross-platform vaccine-related misinformation. Over spring and summer 2021, VP partnered with federal, state, and local stakeholders, as well as civil society organizations and coalitions of medical professionals to support their efforts to understand and counter vaccine hesitancy. Again, we set a very narrowly tailored scope focused on harms for this project as well.
That's very important. So again, she says it's very narrowly focused. She wants you to know, look, we're not going to abuse this extraordinary power to censor that we have. We're going to just censor very narrowly. And then she also says to prevent harm. This is very important because, of course, that is the predicate for censorship that the Supreme Court has allowed some room for, both in the case of fraud and in the case of incitement to violence. You can't engage in speech that is very closely tied to some harm. You can lie to your lover, you can lie if you're a politician, you can lie about what you think you're going to do, but you can't lie in a way that cheats somebody out of their money. Similarly, you can say all sorts of terrible racist, prejudiced things, but you can't do it in a way that would then actually cause a mob to kill somebody or hurt somebody. The courts have been pretty clear about that. So she's already saying we got to focus on harm. I think the other issue about the harm thing is that we know that that's the number one value for progressives. And this audience is mostly for Democrats. It's for people that hate Trump. It's for the anti-disinformation crowd. And for those folks, these are the liberals and progressives who see the highest cause as preventing harm, not, for example, free speech. Harm trumps free speech. I think that's why it has that focus here too for her.
We looked at 4 core categories of claims related to vaccines that actually dated back to the era of concerns about smallpox inoculation: safety, efficacy and necessity, distribution, and then the evolution of some of these things into conspiracy theories. We began to observe that same progression: incidents, narratives, conspiracy theories, and a real attempt by the public to make sense of what they were seeing.
I think another trend we've seen is the abuse of this conspiracy theory stuff. They were censoring people complaining about real vaccine side effects to then go and suggest that all those people, and she's not necessarily, she's just consistently emphasizing the conspiracy theory part of it. You start to conflate people raising genuine concerns about vaccine side effects with the microchips being implanted in your arms type people, or that it was all planned or whatever. So I do think that the conspiracy theory is one way that we've seen them really abuse their powers by overly labeling people that are raising genuine issues as conspiracies.
Very similar to the way in which legitimate questions about COVID origins start to be conflated with China creating a bioweapon on purpose.
Exactly.
Once again, our focus was on enabling situational awareness for a new set of outside partners, particularly civil society and health organizations that had very few other options for understanding the social media conversation.
That means we're trying to expand the surveillance technologies of America's free speech online, expand those surveillance technologies to other government agencies. That's a very important trend we've seen here. They don't want to just keep it all for themselves. They want a whole bunch of government agencies spying. So there's a lot of spying going on.
One was the team behind the hashtag #ThisIsOurShot, a collection of doctors and healthcare workers who really wanted to reach the public as trusted figures to show themselves receiving their vaccines. They wanted to know what narratives they, as doctors, could help counter, what misinformation they could help correct. But to do that, they needed to understand what was really trending or surfacing versus something that one of them might happen to see on social media. So once again, we worked with government stakeholders, not only in facilitating that situational awareness and that understanding of dynamics, but also in thinking about what role government should play here. How could we constructively define misinformation, particularly in an environment like COVID with rapidly evolving scientific consensus?
What role government should play here? So you've already assumed that government should play a role. Why do you assume that government should play a role at all? I mean, maybe it should. You just have a First Amendment you need to worry about. She hasn't established at all that the government would be best to do this. Why not just allow a free, open discussion in the society like we have for 250 years? Why does the government have to be involved in surveilling people's speech online? And why would the government be involved in demanding that social media companies censor it? That's not a particularly American attitude. She hasn't really made the case for it at all. She's just assuming that it needs to be done.
How could we prioritize the preservation of freedom of expression while minimizing the most harmful rumors and conspiracy theories, which were impacting not only individuals, but public health and communities as well?
There it is again, harm.
The problem that confronts us in terms of harmful mis and disinformation is structural. The information infrastructure has changed, and we as a society are adapting. We are never going to live in a world free of mis and disinformation. Such a world has never existed. And the government is not going to snap its fingers and regulate the problem away, because misinformation is ultimately speech. And so while there are plenty of conversations now happening about regulation, most have not yet arrived at a solution space that protects civil liberties while reducing harms.
Because there isn't one.
And yet, that said, the current situation is also untenable.
She just asserts it. We can't have all this misinformation out there. It's obviously we have to do something about it.
So we need something in the short term to help create situational awareness for those equipped to counterspeak, equipped to correct false and misleading claims, to help ensure that the public has access to reliable, accurately contextualized information, and not only from official government sources. And we believe that the power of partnerships holds the key. So here are some learnings from our first two attempts at creating this potential solution. It's labor-intensive work. It requires a division of responsibilities, but I want to flag one thing in particular, and that's the fifth bullet point. Between EIP and VP, we bolstered and expanded our partnerships. We built new technology. We brought on more collaborators.
She's just describing the creation of a censorship industrial complex. I mean, this should send chills down all of your spines. She's talking about all these organizations, all these individual people. All the people have to be involved in this. You need new relationships between government. We have to get a bunch of people involved in it. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. And she's suggesting that this kind of positive, beat of energy, we're building this kind of momentum and fighting this enemy of disinformation. She's talking about censoring her fellow Americans. This is just profoundly messed up.
Government partnerships were not quite there. There was no one obviously in charge. An entity called EII.
There's nobody obviously in charge. I mean, just sit with that for a minute. There's nobody obviously in charge of taking control of the censorship of disinformation. Yeah, that's right. There's nobody in charge of censoring. There should be nobody in charge. That's like kind of, she's describing democracy and freedom of speech as a problem in this.
An entity called EISAC had been profoundly impactful during the election integrity ISAC, serving as a single point of contact for state and local officials and the EIP. And there was no such parallel organization that existed for Virality Project. So there was a lot of effort spent trying to figure out who was in charge and who did what in any given state or locale, as localized false and misleading claims related to vaccines popped up. This meant that when a crisis came that needed those partnerships, they weren't already in place. Civil society relationships are also critical to establish in advance, particularly because these groups have such unique power and impact as counter-speakers. They reach communities that they understand and are members of. So there are two potential recommendations I'd make to CISA today. Our joint objective is to mitigate the impact of harmful misinformation, particularly that which is aimed at weakening our national security through efforts aimed at delegitimizing our institutions, including democratic elections.
That is amazing. She just said we need to focus on stopping speech that delegitimizes institutions. You kind of go, well, okay, that seems fair. We want to, we don't want to like have people out there overthrowing the government. But I mean, you define it like that. That's like basically censoring anybody who says we should, we need a different president. We should abolish the Department of Energy.
The Pentagon are warmongers.
The Pentagon are warmongers. Abolish the police. All of those things can be perceived as pretty easily and defined pretty easily as delegitimizing of institutions. So she wants to censor that. That's where the focus needs to be. The other creepy thing of what she just said is that it has to be national security. Our focus should be on national security. Okay, so we're going to censor for national security, pandemic-related vaccine hesitancy, and delegitimizing institutions. At that point, it's like, what's left? Like, what haven't you created a predicate to censor for at that point?
This type of partnership is not a fact-checking endeavor to debunk misinformation more generally. Our work must always remain focused narrowly on matters of national security that explicitly undercut American institutions.
Well, that might include NATO. That might include the Pentagon.
For instance, for EIP, we focused on content intended to suppress voting, reduce participation, confuse voters as to the election process, or delegitimize election results without evidence.
Like in every case, you can think of an example of legitimate free speech. Like I might say, like she says, suppress voting. Well, maybe I say, hey, there's no point in voting. The system is rigged. You don't have a good candidate. Don't vote. Why can't I say that?
Party. That could be a disruptive
Vote,
election.
vote third party. Don't vote for a Democrat or Republican. Do a write-in candidate. Well, you've just delegitimized institutions. You wrote in Ronald McDonald. How dare you say that you should write in Ronald McDonald? I mean, this is insane.
And that targeted narrow scoping is critical to the success of a partnership.
So that's Orwellian. She just find this huge area that they can censor on: elections, pandemic, vaccines, delegitimized institutions. And then she goes, that narrow targeting, that's not narrow. That's everything.
Creation of a center of excellence within the federal government, for example, could tie in a federal lead.
There it is. That's Renee DiResta surfacing, as far as I know, the first time publicly, the creation of a disinformation governance board, which the Department of Homeland Security, which this agency is a part of, ended up introducing in the spring of 2022. And everybody immediately saw it as a terrifying, un-American, fascist, censorship fucking bullshit, and they pushed back against it and they destroyed it. And where does it come from? It comes from Renee DiResta in this little talk.
With platforms, academics, and nonprofits to stay ahead of these emerging narratives and trends.
To stay ahead of them. Now here we are in pre-crime. This is the pre-bunking. So we can anticipate that there could be speech that we disagree with. And so we're going to work together to prevent that speech from occurring. I mean, you can see when you go down this path of we actually have to censor speech we disagree with, as opposed to just talking back to it, as opposed to just arguing with it, as opposed to just getting out there on the social media platforms, on the newspapers, writing your piece of it, recording your videos, arguing about it, whatever, having public debates. Instead, they're trying to create a censorship industrial complex to surveil all of your fellow Americans, identify a huge amount of topics, and then demanding that the social media platforms censor them and creating tools, including artificial intelligence, to help with that censorship. It's in this sort of calming, turquoise blue, relaxing little video, you can see the entire sinister proposal to undermine our free speech, to undermine the First Amendment. And somebody who appears to be a marginal player in the censorship industrial complex displaying her intellectual leadership and her institutional leadership in really envisioning this complex come into being.
Or, as narratives emerge, the Center of Excellence could deploy experts to relevant federal agencies.
So this Disinformation Governance Board, which she's calling a Center for Excellence, would then send out censors, spies and censors to different government agencies to help them to work on the censorship.
To help prepare pre-bunking and messaging, to identify trusted voices in communities, and to build coalitions to respond.
So go find third-party allies to do the dirty work for you that you can't do as a government agent.
It could also create and promote ongoing resilience products and techniques geared towards the American public.
Resilience products means propaganda. That's all that means. We're going to do propaganda to tell you that something is not a problem when it might be, or when people have speech that we disagree with. We're going to be out there just issuing propaganda.
Because education is really key to us not being perpetually reactive.
Constant propaganda is essential for us maintaining our legitimacy against our critics.
We can establish non-government capability to support research and analysis. Institutionalized capabilities like EIP or VP are needed on an ongoing basis outside of government. And this will also help identify emerging issues for possible pre-bunking and community or civil society coordination to deliver those messages to audiences that really trust what they have to say.
I mean, it's a holistic, you once could say, totalizing agenda. Look at that. I mean, she wants to get everybody on the same page. Civil society organizations, NGOs, government officials, multiple agencies. I mean, it's bonkers. It's not how we do free speech in America.
So in closing, we need multi-stakeholder partnerships
to get around supposedly to get around the First Amendment, though not actually.
That facilitate effective communication.
To spread propaganda.
To enable situational awareness.
Through spying on your fellow Americans.
For government, tech platforms, and community leaders.
Through a totalizing whole of society information war.
While respecting civil liberties and prioritizing free expression.
Oh, without violating the First Amendment. Simple.
Simple, right? So I look forward to the rest of the sessions in this important event, focusing on the power of partnerships. And thank you so much for having me speak today.
No, we're not going to do it, lady. We don't want it.